The sky over Earth darkened as the alien ships arrived, massive structures blocking out the sun. They descended in silence, no grand display of aggression or force. After all, why would they need it? In their long history of conquest across the galaxy, the Zoran had never met any real resistance. Every species they encountered fell into one of two categories: those who surrendered immediately, and those who tried, and failed, to fight back. Humans, they presumed, would fall in the first group. The Zoran were not a species prone to emotion. Cold, calculating, and technologically superior, they had long ago ceased to see themselves as warriors. To them, warfare was a mathematical certainty, a process of domination refined to perfection. Their ships, sleek and bristling with unseen weaponry, hovered over Earth's cities, not out of necessity, but as a reminder of their absolute dominance. They had already sent a single message to humanity, brief and without the slightest hint of threat: surrender and serve, or perish. From orbit, they watched Earth with mild curiosity, noting the flurry of activity among its inhabitants. The humans, as expected, were primitive. Despite their relatively advanced technology, they were still bound by their emotional responses: fear, pride, defiance. The Zoran had seen it before countless times. A futile show of resistance followed by inevitable collapse. The humans would fall, just like all the others. Their primitive weapons and emotional weakness would be their undoing. The Zoran command center, stationed in the largest of their ships, pulsed with cool, efficient energy. Commanders monitored Earth's communications and military activity with detached interest. The human nations, predictably, were scrambling to coordinate their defense, launching satellites and deploying ground forces. It was all rather amusing to the Zoran. They allowed it to continue, not because they were worried, but because they found it entertaining to watch these primitive beings scurry about, desperate to save themselves from the inevitable. The human leaders, they noted, had yet to respond to the message. Silence, but not surrender. This was not unusual. The Zoran knew the humans would try to negotiate, to plead for their survival, but such efforts would be ignored. This was not a discussion. The Zoran did not negotiate. But then, something unexpected happened. A transmission came through from Earth, short and blunt. It wasn't a plea or an attempt to stall for time. It was a single word, delivered with unsettling calm. Perish. The Zoran commander stared at the message in disbelief. There was no context, no explanation. Just that one word. It didn't make sense. Why would a species so clearly outmatched respond with such a pointless threat? It was a minor anomaly, nothing more. A small irregularity in an otherwise predictable process. And so they moved on, preparing for the next phase of their occupation. The humans were, by all accounts, unremarkable. Their emotional responses were well documented, fear-driven, chaotic. But their emotions were their weakness, their inability to detach and see the reality of their situation. The Zoran had long abandoned such flaws. It was why they had never lost a conflict. Their entire species functioned with cold efficiency, driven by logic, not sentiment. What the Zoran didn't know was that their perception of humanity, primitive, emotional, easy to conquer, was about to be shattered. The human response, however, was not what the Zoran expected. They monitored Earth's military frequencies, noting the lack of panic. Sure, there was movement, troops being mobilized, systems going online, defenses being activated, but there was an eerie calm to it. No desperate calls for surrender, no frantic evacuations. It was as though the humans were preparing for something else, something the Zoran had not accounted for. The commanders dismissed it as ignorance. The humans simply didn't understand the magnitude of the threat they were facing. They would soon realize their mistake. On Earth, the human governments had already come to a quiet consensus. There would be no negotiations, no surrender. The alien ships looming over their cities were not an omen to be feared but a challenge to be met head-on. And humanity was ready. For decades they had been preparing, not for these aliens specifically, but for something like this. Survival, after all, was humanity's greatest strength. While the Zoran assumed the humans would be overwhelmed by fear, humanity was anything but. Quiet determination replaced panic. Military leaders met in secured bunkers, finalizing strategies that had been in place for years. Scientists worked in secret labs, unleashing technologies developed in anticipation of just such an event. The Zoran had no idea what was about to hit them. And then came the next message from Earth. It was not a request for peace or a demand for withdrawal. It was simple, direct. You have underestimated us. The Zoran commanders still didn't understand. How could this species, so clearly outmatched, so technologically inferior, believe they had any chance of survival? But the Zoran didn't respond. They didn't need to. They were patient. The humans would soon learn their place. But what happened next shook the Zoran's perception of humanity to its core. Earth's defensive systems went active, not just the crude missiles and aircraft the Zoran had expected, but something far more advanced. Satellites, hidden in orbit, began firing precise, high-energy pulses at the Zoran ships. On the ground, anti-aircraft systems targeted the invaders with unerring accuracy. Within minutes, several Zoran ships were downed, crashing into the oceans and uninhabited regions of Earth. For the first time, the Zoran commanders felt a twinge of uncertainty. This wasn't supposed to happen. Humans weren't supposed to have this kind of technology. They hadn't prepared for a species capable of this level of defense. It was impossible. And yet, it was happening. On Earth, military forces moved with clinical precision. There were no grand speeches, no emotional declarations of defiance, just action. The message from humanity had been clear. Perish. And now the Zoran understood that this wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. The Zoran system scrambled to adjust, but the damage was already done. Their invasion, which they had assumed would be swift and effortless, was now met with organized and efficient resistance. Human forces struck back with a ferocity that left the Zoran reeling. For the first time in their history, the Zoran were facing an enemy they could not simply dominate with superior firepower. The humans were fighting back with technology they should not have had, strategies they should not have known. The Zoran commanders struggled to make sense of it. How had they missed this? How had they underestimated these creatures so badly? But it was too late for questions. The Zoran had come to Earth expecting an easy conquest. Instead, they had awoken a force they could not control. The humans, far from being the helpless, emotional creatures the Zoran had expected, were something else entirely. They were methodical, relentless, and they were not afraid. As more Zoran ships fell from the sky, the commanders finally realized the truth: they had underestimated humanity. And now, they were paying the price. The Zoran had never engaged humans in battle before. Now they understood why. The alien ships hovered, their sleek hulls cutting through the atmosphere as they descended over Earth's major cities. To the Zoran, this was merely a formality. Their initial probes had returned data confirming their belief: human military systems were outdated and insufficient against their advanced technology. The few losses they had incurred were, they assumed, anomalies. These were small setbacks in an otherwise inevitable victory. But despite the initial surprise, they would crush humanity's resistance in due time. They initiated their landing protocols, sending ground troops to secure key locations. Zoran soldiers, tall and imposing in their biomechanical armor, emerged from their craft, expecting to face a disorganized human defense. They were met with silence. No immediate skirmishes, no panic. It was almost too quiet, as if the humans had already resigned to their fate. The Zoran ground forces spread across the cities, their commanders communicating in their cold, analytical tones. They saw no point in waiting for humanity to respond. It was time to move forward with the occupation. The humans would be subdued in a matter of hours, and the planet would soon be under Zoran control. But something was wrong. The Zoran commanders, watching from their ships, began to notice strange movements on the ground. Human troops weren't scattering in fear. Instead, they were positioned strategically, quietly organizing without the frantic chaos the Zoran had anticipated. It wasn't long before the first shots were fired, not by the Zoran, but by the humans. Advanced human drones, barely visible to the naked eye, swarmed the Zoran ground forces, attacking with surgical precision. These weren't the outdated technologies the Zoran had prepared for. These drones were faster, smarter, more deadly than anything the Zoran had encountered before. Within moments, the first wave of Zoran soldiers was cut down. The Zoran ground commanders were shocked, but they quickly adapted, ordering a more aggressive response. Their soldiers fired back with plasma rifles, obliterating buildings and streets in their efforts to eliminate the human threat. They expected the humans to retreat in fear, but instead, the human forces advanced. Tactical units on the ground moved with precision, flanking the Zoran soldiers, using guerrilla tactics that confused their more rigid, militaristic approach. Human forces were relentless, moving with a fluidity that the Zoran had not anticipated. What should have been a straightforward battle of overwhelming force had turned into a tactical nightmare. The Zorans' inability to think outside of their pre-planned strategies was becoming apparent. They relied on their technology to dominate, but the humans had leveled the playing field in a way the Zoran couldn't have imagined. From their command centers aboard the ships, the Zoran leaders watched in disbelief as the battle unfolded. The humans were not falling as expected. They weren't scrambling to save themselves or surrender. They were organized, deliberate, and efficient. It was almost as if they had been preparing for this very moment for decades. The Zoran commanders quickly adapted their plans, deploying more of their ground forces. They activated their shields, rendering human attacks useless, at least for the time being. They unleashed a new wave of weaponry, plasma blasts and energy fields sweeping through the human ranks. Buildings crumbled under the sheer force of their attacks, and yet, the human resistance didn't falter. Then, something even more unexpected happened. The Zoran's most advanced ground units, heavily armored and thought to be impervious to human weaponry, suddenly began to malfunction. Their advanced targeting systems flickered, their shields dropped, and they stood exposed. In that brief moment, human forces struck, taking down entire platoons of Zoran soldiers with remarkable speed. What the Zoran didn't realize was that humans had been studying them long before the invasion. While the Zoran had arrogantly assumed that their technologies were beyond human comprehension, the truth was far more complicated. Humans had been monitoring the Zoran for years. They had reverse-engineered elements of Zoran tech, developed countermeasures, and created entirely new weapons systems in secret. This was not the panicked, desperate response the Zoran had anticipated. It was a well-coordinated counteroffensive. Across the battlefield, Zoran soldiers began falling. Their weapons, once thought invincible, were failing them. Their advanced armor was no longer protecting them as it should. And all the while, the humans pressed forward, using their knowledge of Zoran tactics to dismantle their forces with methodical precision. In orbit, the Zoran commanders scrambled to make sense of the chaos. Their once clear victory had turned into a confusing quagmire of human resistance. They ordered more reinforcements, but even as more troops arrived, the humans continued to push back. For every alien ship that landed, there was a human plan waiting. For every Zoran soldier that stepped onto the battlefield, there was a countermeasure already in place. The Zorans' arrogance, their assumption that humans were simply too primitive to stand against them, had blinded them to the truth. Humanity wasn't fighting with desperation, they were fighting with calculated brilliance. Then came the next blow. Zoran ground communications began to fail. Their advanced communication networks, once believed to be unbreakable, were suddenly offline. Panic rippled through the Zoran ranks. Without clear communication between their ground forces and ships, their ability to coordinate attacks crumbled. It was another stroke of human ingenuity, a targeted cyber attack that had infiltrated the Zoran systems long before the first shots were fired. The Zoran had assumed their systems were too advanced for humans to breach. They were wrong. As Zoran commanders attempted to re-establish control, they were hit with another wave of human attacks, this time more aggressive than before. Human forces, emboldened by their initial successes, pushed the Zoran back, reclaiming lost ground and decimating alien forces with relentless efficiency. It wasn't just military might on display, it was strategy, precision, and sheer human determination. The Zoran commanders, for the first time, began to experience something unfamiliar to their species: fear. This was not the conquest they had expected. Their predictions, their calculations had failed. The humans, who they had dismissed as primitive, emotional creatures, had outplayed them at every turn. The warning, perish, echoed in their minds, no longer an empty threat but a chilling promise. Desperation set in. The Zoran, having never truly faced a foe like this, began to fracture under the pressure. Commanders disagreed on how to proceed. Some called for full withdrawal, while others demanded the use of more extreme measures that could decimate the planet but leave it in ruins. Pride and fear clashed in their ranks. On the ground, the human forces pushed forward with unrelenting focus. They had been ready for this moment, for the challenge of defending their home. While the Zoran had relied on their overwhelming power, the humans had relied on their ingenuity, their adaptability, and their unbreakable resolve. The message had been clear from the start: perish. And now, as the Zoran forces faltered, it was becoming painfully clear to the invaders what that message truly meant. Humanity was not going to surrender. Humanity was not going to beg for its survival. It was going to fight. And for the first time, the Zoran realized that they might actually lose. The Zoran fleet, reeling from the unexpected resistance, scrambled to adapt. The loss of communication and the precision of human strikes were not just humiliating, they were devastating. Commanders on the mothership ordered reinforcements to deploy at an unprecedented rate. They wouldn't admit it to themselves, but panic had begun to creep into their ranks. The humans had proven more formidable than anticipated, but surely they couldn't keep up this level of resistance. Massive Zoran warships descended through the atmosphere, their bulk darkening the skies. They unleashed devastating plasma strikes, intending to overwhelm human defenses. They expected this show of force to bring humanity to its knees, to demoralize and dismantle whatever remained of Earth's resistance. The humans, after all, could only do so much with their planet already on the verge of destruction, or so the Zoran thought. But humanity was not caught off guard. The moment the warships deployed, hidden ground-based systems responded in kind. Anti-aircraft missile systems fired, but these weren't just typical ballistic rockets. They were precision-guided, energy-infused weapons, designed specifically to pierce through the Zoran's energy shields. As plasma blasts lit up the sky, human missiles sliced through the defenses of the alien ships, crashing into their hulls with deadly accuracy. One by one, the massive Zoran warships exploded, pieces of their once proud armada raining down across the globe. From Earth's surface, human leaders watched the destruction unfold with grim satisfaction. They knew this was far from over, but the tide was turning. The Zoran commanders couldn't believe it. Their most powerful ships, their impenetrable defenses, defeated. The failure of their tactical planning was now laid bare for all to see. They hadn't just underestimated human tenacity, they had completely misjudged the entire situation. The arrogance that had been their shield for so long was now shattered. And with each passing moment, they were losing more ground. In orbit, the mothership's command center became a whirlwind of activity. Alien commanders debated fiercely, some pushing for a full-scale planetary bombardment to obliterate Earth, regardless of the consequences. Others, more cautious, feared that such actions could provoke retaliation in ways they couldn't yet predict. Their indecision was paralyzing. They were used to having total control, and now they found themselves in a position they had never encountered, at war with an opponent who fought back intelligently, fiercely, and without hesitation. On Earth, human forces continued to push forward. Ground troops, drones, and mechanized units advanced across battle-scarred cities, systematically hunting down the remaining Zoran soldiers. The battles were brutal, but the humans maintained an upper hand. They had turned the Zoran's own strategies against them, exploiting their rigid military doctrine and inflexible tactics. The Zoran fought as if they were still in control, but they weren't. They were being led into traps, their forces ambushed, their weapons neutralized by human ingenuity. The Zoran, for all their advanced technology, simply couldn't match the humans' ability to adapt. Every time the invaders tried to gain an advantage, humanity had a countermeasure in place. From underground bunkers, human engineers and tacticians worked around the clock, developing new ways to disrupt the Zoran's technology and cripple their forces. Soon, it became clear to the Zoran commanders that brute force was not going to win this battle. They needed to shift their strategy, but there was no time. Their losses were mounting too quickly, and human forces were relentless. The Zoran had expected a swift and easy victory, but now they were facing something they had never encountered before, a species that wasn't afraid to fight for survival, and one that was winning. Back on the Zoran mothership, panic continued to spread. Reports from the surface painted a grim picture. The humans weren't just defending, they were actively dismantling the Zoran invasion force. Entire battalions of alien soldiers were wiped out by human ambushes. Ground troops found themselves surrounded and outmaneuvered, their advanced weaponry useless against the precise strikes of human forces. The Zoran's invincible image was crumbling with every passing hour. The aliens had never known defeat before. They had conquered world after world, species after species, without significant resistance. Their strategy had always been simple: overwhelm their enemies with superior technology and force. But here, on Earth, they were learning a harsh lesson. Human ingenuity, coupled with their unparalleled will to survive, had turned what should have been an easy conquest into a nightmare. Then came the moment the Zoran feared most: their orbital fleet was under attack. Human ships, modified and upgraded with reverse-engineered alien technology, launched from hidden bases across the planet. These weren't the primitive vessels the Zoran had initially dismissed. They were outfitted with advanced weaponry, capable of penetrating Zoran shields and tearing through their defenses. The human fleet struck hard and fast, catching the Zoran off guard. What little coordination the alien commanders had left was shattered as their ships were picked apart in the vacuum of space. Massive explosions rippled through the Zoran armada, sending debris spiraling toward Earth's atmosphere. On the ground, humans watched as the battle in the skies unfolded. What had once seemed impossible was now happening before their eyes. The invaders, the unstoppable force that had appeared on their doorstep, were now fleeing, trying to regroup in the face of overwhelming human retaliation. But there was no escape. Humanity had drawn a line, and they weren't backing down. Desperation gripped the Zoran command. They had only one option left, one they had never considered: retreat. It was an unthinkable concept for the Zoran, a species that had never known defeat. But now, as their ships were destroyed, their ground forces decimated, and their communications severed, they had no choice. The order was given. The Zoran fleet, or what was left of it, began to withdraw. Ships that had once hung over Earth like a shroud now fled back into space, broken and battered. The invasion had failed. The Zoran had been defeated not by superior numbers or overwhelming force, but by a species they had dismissed as weak and primitive. Humanity had not only survived, they had triumphed. On Earth, as the last of the Zoran forces retreated, a quiet sense of victory settled over the planet. There were no grand celebrations, no triumphant parades. Humanity knew this was just one battle in a much larger war, a war that would continue as long as the Zoran remained a threat. But for now, they had sent a clear message. The Zoran had underestimated them, had believed they could conquer with ease. They had ignored humanity's warning. And now, as the remnants of the alien fleet disappeared into the void, the truth of that warning resonated. Perish! The Zoran had thought it was a threat. Now, they understood it had been a promise. The Zoran fleet limped away, crippled and defeated. Their retreat was a far cry from the confident invasion that had begun only days earlier. What had started as a mere formality, a routine conquest, had turned into their greatest humiliation. They had faced a species they believed to be inferior, one they could easily crush with their advanced technology and military might. But now, as they fled, the reality was undeniable. They had been bested, outmatched by a species they had considered beneath them. On Earth, the humans were already regrouping. There were no lengthy speeches or extravagant celebrations, just quiet, methodical preparations for what came next. They knew the Zoran might return, but they weren't afraid. In fact, they welcomed the challenge. Humanity had faced extinction before and survived. The Zoran were just the latest in a long line of threats that had underestimated what humans were capable of when pushed to the brink. The remnants of the Zoran command were in disarray. Once proud, once unshakable, they now argued among themselves, their cold logic cracking under the weight of defeat. The truth was undeniable, even to them: humanity had beaten them, not through sheer force, but through adaptability and cunning. The Zoran had never encountered such resistance, never faced an enemy that could think, react, and counter their every move with such precision. Their plans had been flawless, in theory, but humanity had turned those plans inside out. As they fled the solar system, the Zoran received one final transmission from Earth. It was brief, but its meaning was clear. Don't come back. It wasn't a plea or a desperate warning. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same cold, calculating precision that the Zoran had once prided themselves on. For the first time in their history, they understood what it felt like to be on the other side of an inevitable outcome. The Zoran High Command, once untouchable in their arrogance, were silent. They had no response, no rebuttal. They knew now that they were not invincible. They had not only been defeated, but humiliated. Their ships, once considered the pinnacle of technological supremacy, had been reduced to wreckage. Their soldiers, once thought unstoppable, had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outwitted at every turn. The thought of returning to their homeworld, of explaining this failure, filled them with dread. Meanwhile, humanity pressed forward. There was no time for complacency. Engineers and scientists worked tirelessly to improve the technologies they had reverse-engineered from the Zoran, pushing the limits of what was possible. Military leaders refined their strategies, studying every detail of the battle to ensure that if the Zoran, or anyone else, returned, Earth would be even more prepared. It was no longer just about survival. It was about showing the galaxy what humanity was capable of. The Zoran hadn't just failed to conquer Earth. They had sparked something far more dangerous. Humanity had always been resilient, but now they were united in a way the Zoran could never have anticipated. No longer bound by borders or petty conflicts, humanity was focused, driven by a common goal: to ensure that no species ever threatened them again. The Zoran had awakened something they could not hope to control, a species that thrived under pressure, that evolved in the face of adversity. As the Zoran limped back toward their homeworld, their once proud leaders struggled to comprehend the enormity of their failure. They had never experienced such a defeat. Their entire civilization had been built on the premise of superiority, on the idea that they were destined to rule the galaxy. And yet, a species they had considered primitive had shattered that illusion. The Zoran had never bothered to understand humanity, never tried to comprehend the depths of their tenacity. And it had cost them everything. Back on Earth, life resumed, but it was different now. The world had changed, and with it, humanity's place in the galaxy. The Zoran invasion had unified the planet in a way nothing else could have. For the first time in centuries, humanity wasn't divided by politics or borders. They had a common purpose now, one that extended far beyond Earth. They knew the Zoran weren't the only threat out there, and they were determined to be ready for whatever came next. The simple message, "Perish," had been more than just a warning to the Zoran. It had been a declaration of intent, a statement that humanity would not be subjugated, would not be broken. The Zoran, in their arrogance, had dismissed it as the bravado of a doomed species. But now they knew. It wasn't bravado. It was the truth. The Zoran leadership, scattered and broken, faced an uncertain future. Their empire, once vast and unchallenged, was now in jeopardy. Other species, long oppressed by the Zoran, began to rise up, emboldened by the knowledge that the Zoran were not invincible. Rumors spread across the galaxy about the humans, the species that had defeated the mighty Zoran. Whispers of rebellion grew louder as the Zoran struggled to maintain control of their territories. Earth, meanwhile, was becoming something more. No longer content to remain isolated, humanity began to look outward, to the stars. They had seen what was out there, and they had no intention of waiting for the next invasion. The same ingenuity and determination that had driven them to victory against the Zoran now propelled them forward into space. New ships were built, New technologies developed, and soon, humanity was ready to take its place among the stars, not as conquerors, but as survivors who had proven their worth. The Zoran, once the undisputed rulers of the galaxy, were now reduced to a shadow of their former selves. They had been brought low not by a superior force, but by a species they had underestimated at every turn. And as they retreated to lick their wounds, they knew one thing with absolute certainty: they could never face humanity again. The cost had been too high, the humiliation too great. Humanity, on the other hand, stood stronger than ever. Their victory against the Zoran had sent ripples through the galaxy. They had proven that they could not only survive but thrive under the most extreme circumstances. They were no longer the vulnerable species the Zoran had once seen. They had become something far more dangerous, something that the Zoran, and every other species in the galaxy, would have to reckon with. The message was clear. Humanity had risen, and they were not going back. For the Zoran, the warning had been simple: perish. And they had, in every way that mattered. As the remnants of the Zoran fleet disappeared into the cold depths of space, humanity turned their gaze to the stars. They had survived the unthinkable and emerged victorious. Now, they would decide their own destiny. And for anyone else out there who might think to challenge them, the message remained the same: perish.